Hey y'all! So I found another book online that I'm really excited to read today. It's all about serial killers. And if you follow me on Twitter, I tweeted last night and asked you guys if you would be interested in a series about serial killers. And the response was overwhelmingly yes, so we're gonna do this. I also mentioned this book in my rambling video from a couple days ago, and I've decided that I'm gonna read this book when I'm able to travel again because I would really like to visit the places in this book since this is like primarily Arizona. Well, it's only Arizona. This is just Arizona ghost stories. So I really want to save this book for when I'm able to travel to these places because I think it would be a really good series to do. Be like me staying at these haunted hotels and explaining the stories of the people who worked there, people who stayed there. So I'm gonna save this book. I'm not gonna read out of it just yet. However, I am gonna do the most haunted places in each state because it seemed like a lot of you guys were really interested in that series as well. So I'm really excited because I feel like I have so many new series coming your way and it makes me really excited to like film and all this shit, and I'm really excited to get into this book. This book is called The Big Book of Serial Killers, an encyclopedia of serial killers. And there is 150 serial killers in this book, so we're gonna read about a couple of them today. These sections are a little bit shorter, so it goes into like their backstory a little bit as well as the crimes that they committed, but I'm gonna read about a couple of serial killers in this video. This is not just gonna be based on one killer. I'm gonna lower you down a little bit. I also noticed when I was reading this book last night that they don't really talk about the victims that much, so if you guys are interested in me going into more detail about the victims themselves, please let me know. I probably can't do it for every single serial killer that we learn about, but if there's like one specific case where you want me to go into more detail about the victims, I can totally do that. I had somebody tweet me yesterday saying that it would be nice if I talked about the victims more than the serial killer, but this book unfortunately is mostly focused on the killer themselves. So if you want me to find something else and you don't really like this, I can totally do that, or I can just stop the series altogether, but we'll give it a shot. We'll do one video about it and we'll see if you guys like it, and if you don't like it, we don't have to do it again. I feel like I'm talking to like my children right now. Like, if we don't like it, we don't have to do it again. It's fine. It's fine. We don't have to do it again. But we're gonna try it out. We're gonna see if you guys like this book. And I'm gonna just keep moving you because I want to be comfortable. So the first serial killer that we're gonna learn about is Charles Albright. This is a trigger warning for sexual assault, rape, and murder. These stories get very heavy. I'm filming this part after I've already read all the stories, so I know ahead of time how heavy these stories are. If you can't handle something like that, please do not watch this video. Albright was adopted by Fred and Dell Albright after they discovered him in an orphanage. Fortunately for Albright, Dell was a school teacher, and he was able to jump 2 grades at school due to her diligence and help with his education. She was a strict parent, but also overprotective. As a teenager, Albright began shooting small animals with a gun, and he showed some interest in taxidermy. His mother, wanting to encourage him in his hobby, would help him stuff the dead animals. By the time he was 13, Albright had already been arrested for aggravated assault and was known to be a petty thief. Yet his accelerated education enabled him to finish school at 15 and enroll in a university. Though he had planned to become a doctor, he was unable to complete his pre-med training. He was arrested by the police again at the age of 16 for theft, and this time he was sent to prison for a year. Upon his release, he enrolled in a teacher's college, majoring in pre-med studies. He was thrown out of the college when stolen property was found in his possession. It was at this time that Albright embarked in a career in forgery. He created false documents showing he had attained both bachelor's and master's degrees, and he began forging signatures. He married his girlfriend from college, and they welcomed a daughter. Albright continued to forge checks, and while he was working as a teacher at a high school, his forgery was discovered and he was put on probation. The couple divorced in 1974. Albright was caught stealing merchandise from a hardware store worth hundreds of dollars and was sent to prison again, this time for 2 years. However, he was released after serving only 6 months. Upon his release, he made friends with his neighbors and he became a trusted babysitter for children in the neighborhood. During a visit to a friend's home in 1981, Albright was caught molesting their 9-year-old daughter. At court, he pled guilty and was placed on probation. Only fucking probation. Albright later said he wasn't guilty, but had said he was to avoid hassles. In 1985, Albright was living in Arkansas when he met a lady named Dixie, who quickly moved in with him. Before long, Dixie was supporting him and paying the bills. Early in the mornings, however, Albright would deliver newspapers. That wasn't all he was doing, though. Unbeknownst to Dixie, he was also visiting prostitutes. Albright's first murder took place on December 13, 1990. The body of prostitute Mary Lou Pratt was discovered in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas. She had been killed by a gunshot to the back of the head from a .44 caliber firearm. The victim was wearing only a t-shirt and bra. Both had been pushed up to expose her breasts. Mary Lou's eyes were shut and her face and chest were covered in bruises. When the medical examiner lifted her eyelids, he discovered that both of her eyes had been removed and taken from the scene. On February 10, 1991, the body of another prostitute was found. She was also almost completely nude. Susan Peterson had been shot once through the top of her head, once in the back of her head, and once in her left breast. Her body was found just outside of the city limits of South Dallas. She, too, was missing her eyes. Shirley Williams was the third prostitute found dead in the area. She had been shot twice, once through the top of her head and once in the face. She had also suffered a beating with multiple bruises on her face and a broken nose. Like the two other victims, her eyes had been removed. Albright was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder on March 22, 1991. The trial started on December 13, 1991. At first, it seemed the prosecution's case was going to collapse, as most of the evidence was only circumstantial. However, there was also strong forensic evidence, as hairs from the murder scene of Shirley Williams were matched to Albright. By December 18, 1991, the jury had already adjourned to deliberate. They quickly returned with a verdict of guilty, but only for the murder of Shirley Williams. As a result of the conviction, Albright was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. He will spend the rest of his natural life in prison. So that's a pretty good example of what all of these are going to look like. They're pretty short, but it's basically just a summary of their early life and then the crimes that they committed, as well as their punishment for the crimes. This next killer we're going to learn about is Rodney Alcala, and I'm probably going to mispronounce a lot of these people's names, and I apologize for that, but I believe it's Alcala. Rodney Alcala was born in San Antonio, Texas. In 1951, his parents Raul and Ana Maria moved the family to Mexico. His father abandoned the family just 3 years later. When Alcala was about 11 years old, he moved to Los Angeles with his mother and his siblings. In 1960, at the age of 17, Alcala enlisted in the U.S. Army and became a clerk. Things started to go very wrong, though, in 1964 when Alcala went AWOL from the Army and hitchhiked to his mother's house. A military psychiatrist was tasked with assessing Alcala, and he determined he was suffering from antisocial personality disorder. Subsequently, he was medically discharged from the Army. Alcala went on to study at the UCLA School of Fine Arts, from which he graduated. He first came under police scrutiny in 1968 following the rape of an 8-year-old girl. He had been seen luring the girl into his apartment, but was able to flee before the police got there, leaving the girl beaten. Alcala then enrolled in the NYU Film School and studied under Roman Polanski, using the name John Berger to put the police off his trail. Over the next several years, Alcala continued to get arrested for a number of crimes, including assault on a young girl and drug possession. And he later admitted to knocking a 15-year-old girl unconscious and raping her while posing as a professional photographer. Although he had been convicted of rape and was therefore a registered sex offender, he still managed to become a contestant in 1978 on The Dating Game, a televised dating show. It is believed he had already murdered 2 women by this time. The show's host described him as a photographer who liked motorcycling and skydiving. Remarkably, Alcala won the date with the Bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw, but she thought he was creepy and refused to go out with him. Jill Barcombe was a runaway from New York when she disappeared in 1977. Her body was discovered in a Los Angeles ravine, and she had been rolled up like a ball. At first, investigators thought she may have been a victim of the hillside strangler, but DNA evidence later showed Alcala to be responsible for her death. Also murdered in 1977 was Georgia Wickstead, who had been bludgeoned to death inside her apartment in Malibu. Charlotte Lamb was murdered in the laundry room of her apartment complex after being raped and strangled. Joe Parenthood was also killed in her apartment in Burbank. These 4 murders were all linked to Alcala through DNA. Another murder that took place in 1977 was that of Pamela Jean Lamson. Pamela had gone missing after traveling to Fisherman's Wharf, where she had arranged to meet a photographer. Her body was found near a hiking trail in Marin County, naked and battered. Christine Ruth Thornton disappeared in 1977 in Wyoming. Her body wasn't found until 1982, and her remains were unidentified until DNA testing was done with the samples from her relatives. An autopsy showed that she had been around 6 months pregnant when she was murdered. Alcala later claimed that he did take photographs of Christine, but he denied murdering her. 12-year-old Robin Samso disappeared on June 20th, 1979, somewhere between her ballet class and a visit to the beach. Her body was discovered several days later, dumped in the Los Angeles foothills. Detectives had been circulating a composite sketch of the man suspected of killing Robin Samso, and, as a result, Alcala was identified by his own parole officer. Officers searched his mother's home, during which they located a receipt for a storage locker belonging to Alcala in Seattle. When they went through the locker, they discovered hundreds of photographs of young girls, many of which were nude, and a pair of earrings identified as belonging to Robin Samso, as well as another pair that would later be traced back to Charlotte Lamb through DNA testing. Alcala was arrested on July 27, 1979, and charged with Robin Samso's murder. He went to trial and was found guilty, receiving a death sentence in 1980. In 1984, the sentence was overturned because the jury had been informed of his previous crimes, which wasn't allowable. It was overturned a second time in 1986 as a result of claims that a witness had been hypnotized. In 2003, Alcala was linked to 2 more murders through DNA. By 2010, he had stood trial for 5 murders: Robin Samso, Georgia Wickstead, Jill Barcombe, Charlotte Lamb, and Jill Parenthood. Alcala was found guilty of all 5 murders and remained on death row. In 2011, he was indicted for the murders of Ellen Hover and Cornelia Crilly in New York, and he pled guilty to both in December of 2012. There are numerous other cases that Alcala is a suspect in, but many won't be prosecuted because he's already received the maximum sentence possible: death. Posing as a photographer was the main component of Alcala's MO, and investigators found 100 photographs in his possession following his arrest. They released 120 of these to the media in the hopes the public might be able to help identify the women and young girls in them. Police wanted to know if any of them were also murder victims. In the first weeks of photographs being made public, around 21 women came forward to identify themselves. In 2013, a family member recognized a woman in one of the photographs and identified her as Christine Thornton, 28, who had been found murdered in Wyoming in 1982. Alcala was eventually charged with that murder but was unable to travel to Wyoming to stand trial due to ill health. An additional 900 photographs from Alcala's collection were too sexually explicit to be shown to the public. That one is definitely a lot more heavy than the previous one that we read. I mean, they're all going to be very heavy stories because it's going to involve murder and potentially rape, but holy fucking shit. That one was actually really hard to get through, I can't even lie. And then this last one that we're going to learn about is Daniel Barbosa. He had 72 to 150 victims, so I have a feeling this one's also going to be really heavy. When Barbosa was a young boy, his mother died. His father, who is described as being emotionally distant yet overbearing, remarried. Barbosa's stepmother was apparently abusive. She punished him regularly and would dress him up in girls' clothes to humiliate him in front of other children. As an adult, Barbosa had a live-in relationship with a woman named Alkira, and they went on to have 2 children together. However, Barbosa fell in love with Esperanza. They had planned to get married until he discovered she wasn't a virgin. Barbosa somehow managed to convince Esperanza that he would stay in a relationship with her, provided she helped him find girls who were virgins that he could have sex with, and she agreed. Esperanza would lure the young girls to the apartment and then drug them with sleeping pills so Barbosa could rape them. 5 young girls were raped in this manner, but they were all released without any further harm. The 5th girl, however, reported the rape to the authorities, and both were arrested. Barbosa was charged with sexual assault and sentenced to 3 years in prison. 3 years! But another judge was brought in and converted his sentence to 8 years. After serving the full term, he was released back into society. Barbosa was arrested in Brazil in 1973 for not having correct documentation. He was traveling and living under a false name, which led to his criminal records being delayed from Colombia, and he was subsequently deported. On his return to Colombia, he began selling televisions on the street in Barranquilla? I'm not sure how to say that. Not long after this, he embarked on his reign of murderous terror. Shortly after he returned to Colombia in 1973, Barbosa was walking past his school one day and kidnapped a 9-year-old girl. He raped her and then murdered her so she would not be able to tell the police. This was his first known murder, but it most certainly wouldn't be his last. He was caught and convicted of this murder after returning to the scene of the crime to retrieve a television, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. In December of 1977, he was sent to a prison located on Gorgona, an island off of Colombia. Barbosa spent quite a bit of time studying the ocean's currents, and he escaped in November of 1984 using a crudely built boat. After his escape, the authorities assumed he had either been eaten by sharks or had died at sea. However, he managed to make his way to Quito in Ecuador. From there, he traveled to I'm going to mispronounce all of these places. He traveled to Guayaquil around December 5th. On December 18th, he kidnapped another 9-year-old girl. The following day, he kidnapped a 10-year-old girl. Between the years of 1984 and 1986, it is estimated Barbosa committed a minimum of 54 rapes and murders in Guayaquil. Because of the high number of victims, the authorities initially thought the crimes were being committed by a group or a gang, and didn't consider it could be the work of just one person. To lure his young victims outside the main part of town, Barbosa often pretended to be a foreigner who was looking for a church. He would flash large amounts of money in front of them and offer to pay them if they showed him how to get to the church. His victims were always young, helpless, and poor, many of whom would be out on the streets trying to find some work. Once Barbosa had convinced them, he would tell them he knew of a shortcut through the woods. If they seemed hesitant or wary, he would let them go, as there were always plenty of other possible victims out there for him to try and lure. When they were out of sight of potential witnesses, he would rape and then kill them, usually by strangling or stabbing them. Often the bodies were dismembered using a machete. When Barbosa was later asked why he preferred children, he explained he liked to hear them cry. On February 26, 1986, Barbosa was arrested just minutes after he murdered a little girl. He had been approached by 2 policemen who thought he was acting suspiciously, and when they got close to him, they discovered he was carrying a bag that contained the bloodstained clothes of his victim and part of her genitals. He initially told the police his name was Manuel Bulgarian Solis, but a surviving rape victim later identified him as Barbosa. While interviewed, he claimed to be responsible for the murders of 72 girls in Ecuador. He then showed the authorities where he had dumped many of the bodies, most of which had been dismembered. He was convicted in 1989 but received only 25 years imprisonment as his sentence, which is the maximum in Ecuador. He was sent to the Garcia Moreno de Quinto jail, which also housed Pedro Alonso Lopez. Barbosa was murdered in prison in November of 1994. His murderer was the cousin of one of his many victims. I actually think I'm going to read about one more because I don't want this video to be too short, so this next one is about Robert Bordello. In 1939, Bordello was born into a Catholic family. His father was a die setter at the Ford Motor Company while his mother stayed at home. Bordello suffered from severe nearsightedness, and so, at the age of 5, was given thick glasses to wear. Bordello did well at school, although his teachers had difficulty teaching him. He was often bullied by other school children, most likely because of his glasses. His father died suddenly at the age of 39, when Bordello was 16 years old. Not long afterwards, his mother remarried, which made Bordello angry and resentful. Around this time, Bordello had been working at a local restaurant, and he later claimed that he had been sexually assaulted by one of his male co-workers. In 1967, Bordello began to study at the Kansas City Art Institute. He hoped to become a professor. During his time at the institute, he began torturing animals, including a dog, chicken, and a duck. It was also at this time he began selling drugs and drinking alcohol, and when he was 19, he was arrested for possession of marijuana and LSD. Luckily for Bordello, he was released 5 days later due to lack of evidence. Bordello was eventually expelled from college following the murder of a dog, supposedly for the sake of his art. He then went on to train as a chef, and he became rather successful at it. He even helped set up a training program for other aspiring chefs and was a member of the local Chefs Association. Ironically, Bordello was also a member of his local neighborhood watch and crime prevention associations. By the time Bordello was 32 years old, he was openly gay. After quitting his work as a chef, he opened an antique-type store called Bob's Bazaar Bazaar. For a while, he was in a relationship with a Vietnam veteran, but when this ended, he started spending his time with male prostitutes. He would befriend them and try and help them get out of the prostitution world, but there was much more to Bordello's interest in male prostitutes than simply trying to help them have a better life. In July of 1984, Bordello drugged his friend Jerry Howell, who was a sex worker, and kept him captive in the basement of his home overnight. During this time, he raped him repeatedly and then finally ended the torture by asphyxiating him. Less than a year later, Bordello drugged another friend, Robert Sheldon, and kept him in the basement. He experienced a moment of guilt at one point and took Sheldon to a doctor for treatment, but then he took him back to the basement and kept him there until he killed him on April 15th. Bordello found Mark Wallace hiding in his shed during a storm in June and invited him to shelter inside of his house. Once inside, he was drugged like the others and then raped and tortured before he was killed. In September, Bordello went to a gay bar and met James Ferris. Bordello took James back to his place and held him captive for weeks, repeatedly raping and torturing the young man until he finally murdered him. In June of 1986, male prostitute Todd Stoops was lured back to Bordello's house, which wasn't difficult because they had known each other for a while. He was kept captive for 6 weeks until he died from blood loss and an infection. The following year, Larry Pearson was bailed out of jail by Bordello and ended up being locked in Bordello's basement. When Bordello tired of Pearson, he bludgeoned him until he was unconscious, then put a bag over his head and suffocated him using a ligature around his neck. The last known victim of Bordello was Chris Bryson, a prostitute who was abducted in March of 1988. Although he had been locked in the basement, he managed to escape and ran to the house next door and raised the alarm. On April 2, 1988, Bordello was arrested. When his home was searched, officers discovered written logs of the torture Bordello had inflicted on his victims, as well as vast numbers of Polaroid photographs of them. Some of the torture included punching his fist into their anal cavity, administering electrical shocks, injecting drain cleaner into their vocal cords, and using cotton swabs to put bleach in their eyes. He also tried to gouge out the eyes of the victims just to see what would happen. Bordello had kept 2 skulls buried in his backyard for a while, but then dug them up and placed them in a closet with the teeth and envelopes nearby. All of his victims had been dismembered, put into trash bags, and left on the curb for the trash collectors to take to the local landfill. Because of this, the bodies of his victims were never located. Without the bodies as evidence, it was going to be very difficult for the prosecution to get a guilty verdict in court. Therefore, they made a deal with Bordello. If he confessed to his crimes and gave the details of each murder, they wouldn't seek the death penalty. He would receive only a life sentence. Bordello, unaware of the lack of evidence, agreed to the deal and pled guilty after confessing. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In 1992, Bordello wrote letters to a minister where he claimed the prison officials were preventing him from receiving his heart medication. Not long afterwards, Bordello died from a heart attack. That is all I'm going to read for right now. Let me know if you guys like this and if you want me to continue this. If you don't like it as much or if it's too much, because I didn't realize how heavy these stories were. I still find them really interesting and I'm totally down to keep reading them, but if they're too heavy for you guys or you just don't really like this, we don't have to continue this series. Like I said at the beginning, there are 150 serial killers in this book, so this series could go on for a long time if you guys like it. If you have any other ideas for different series that I could do, or if you guys have ever found like interesting books that you would like me to read, please send them to me or comment down below if you have like any ideas. I feel like we have a good thing going right now. I have a couple new series, but if you don't like this video and you have a suggestion for something better, then let me know. But other than that, I'm gonna go. I love you guys. I will see you in the next one. Bye! This is my first time ever straightening my extensions, but it's very obvious where my hair is and where the extensions are. But I actually kind of really like it straightened. I've never done that before. I feel like Madonna. I don't know why, with my long ponytail. I don't know. See ya.